the 53rd session of the Commission. As you already know, COVID-19 we are convinced that a strong legal framework will facilitate the recovery and help to revitalize global trade. I would like to take the opportunity to congratulate to the Secretariat of UNCITRAL for all the efforts displayed for the organization of these important webinars. In this occasion, we will discuss about identification and authentication in the digital economy, which is increasingly playing a substantive role on online commerce. With no more dilation, I would like now to give the floor to Madam Secretary Anne Van Brett to deliver some introductory remarks about this topic. Please, Anne, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, dear participants in the UNCITRAL COVID-19 Response and Recovery webinar series. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all virtually for the third day of the 53rd Commission session and the first day of the series of webinars that will take place today, tomorrow, and in 4 days of next week. I'm grateful to member states of UNCITRAL that have suggested very early on that UNCITRAL texts are very relevant to tackle some of the multiple challenges states are facing to mitigate the disastrous consequences on the economy and take measures to help recovery. We know that many regions are not yet at the stage of recovery, but that there is planning ahead for the new reality and the recovery of the economy. It's with this in mind that we are humbly hoping to make a contribution and that my colleagues have designed this webinar session that is starting this morning. So to kick off the series, we have a first panel on identification and authentication in the digital economy, a very topical discussion around the suite of legal texts UNCITRAL has developed on electronic communications and electronic signatures in cross-border trade, and the work that we're currently developing in Working Group 4 on electronic identification and trust services in international trade. I'm delighted that we have before us to discuss these issues a panel of such distinguished and diverse speakers, distinguished in their contribution to digital trade and transformation, and diverse in their multidisciplinary backgrounds, reflecting the fact that we lie at the junction of law and tech, as I had to find out in the exploratory work we've been conducting in the Secretariat on this topic, but diverse also as far as the geographic locations are concerned. And I'm also very pleased to welcome so many participants. We have received over 1,500 responses as of this morning from stakeholders and interested parties from all over the world, covering very different geographical regions. And among the registered participants, I'm happy to let you know that we have 53% of females joining us today. I have been informed that this figure is still going up as we speak. Registrations are closed for day 1 and day 2, but are still open for the other days, for which the registrations will close 2 days prior to each session. So without further ado, I'm going to giving the floor to the moderator for this session, my colleague Alexander Kunzelmann. Alexander is on the team of our Working Group 4 on digital identity and trust services, and he will be joining us and leading you through the discussions of this morning's session. Thank you very much. Alex, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Anna. Welcome, panelists. Welcome, attendees. Thank you so much for joining us. We have, as Anna mentioned, we have a very distinguished and diverse panel for you today. My name is Alex Kunzelmann, and I am Legal Officer with the UNCITRAL Secretariat. I'm here joined with colleagues. Many of the panelists will be familiar with Luca Castellani, also a legal officer here at the UNCITRAL Secretariat. Before introducing the panel, I wanted to just lay a few ground rules about how this panel will take place and the discussions that will follow it. So first we have the panel session, which will go for slightly over 1 hour with 5 presentations from each of our panels. Then this will be followed by state interventions and then a Q&A session. Now, on the topic of the state interventions, we would like to encourage all states who are joining this webinar to make use of the state intervention section, which will take place, as I mentioned, immediately following the panel, so in about just over 1 hour's time. Now, to do so, and to ensure that this can flow as smoothly as possible, I would invite each state wishing to take the floor to use the Q&A widget or feature on the Cisco WebEx platform to mention your state name. That's all you need to do so that we know that you would like to take the floor. You probably at this stage can't see the Q&A widget because that will only be activated towards the end of the panel, just to ensure that we can control the proceedings. Now, as well, after the state interventions, we'll have a general Q&A session, which will be for all attendees for them in which to participate. Now, attendees will be able to use that Q&A widget as well to write their questions, and we will do our best to put those questions to the panelists towards the end of this session. And then the session will close after the Q&A session with some remarks from Angelo Faria, Principal Legal Officer and Head of the Legislative Branch at the UNCITRAL Secretariat. So as I mentioned, panelists will have about 15 minutes to present, and I will use a very old-fashioned bell to announce when there is 2 minutes to go to ensure that we keep to schedule as much as possible. So now with that housekeeping out of the way, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first panelist, Mr. Andrea Savida, who is head of the Knowledge Management and Innovative Systems Unit within the Directorate General for Communications, Networks, Content and Technology of the European Union. His unit is in charge of knowledge management, data analytics, web technologies and IT governance, where he leads the adoption of advanced digital technologies to streamline business processes, decision-making and collaboration towards an efficient digital administration. Previously, Mr. Savida led the e-Government and Trust Unit within the Directorate General for Communications, Networks, Content and Technology, DG Connect, and also the task force in charge of the adoption and implementation of the 2014 EU regulation on electronic identification and trust services, better known as the eIDAS regulation. And this will be something that I understand that Mr. Savida will be addressing in his presentation. Before joining the Commission in 1993, Mr. Savida worked in industry for nearly 8 years as a project manager of international research and development projects on decision support systems for environmental, civil and industrial emergency risk and risk management. So it gives me great pleasure to pass the floor to Mr. Savida for his presentation. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt your presentation there. It appears that we do have difficulties with your audio. We can hear you, but it's very stuttered. So what I suggest that we do is that we might proceed to Mr. Serge Adjovi while we just resolve that audio link. So again, my apologies. If we can pass the floor to Mr. Adjovi. Before doing so, I will just introduce Mr. Adjovi with a view that we'll come back to Mr. Savida for his presentation. Mr. Adjovi is the Director of the Agency for Digital Development, a government agency responsible for implementing the National Digital Strategy and Digitalization in Benin. He also serves as the Director General of the Information Services and Systems Agency, a body responsible for the operational implementation of programs and projects within the framework of development strategies for secure digital information services and systems in Benin. Mr. Adjovi has more than 30 years' experience in the telecommunications and digital solutions sector in a range of managerial, technical and commercial roles, mostly in Africa. A telecommunications engineer by training, Mr. Ajovi previously held the position of General Manager for Western and Central Africa and Director of Distribution with Cisco. Should be familiar with this platform, based in South Africa. So, Mr. Ajovi, it's a pleasure to have you. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and I do hope that you hear me.
Perfectly well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. My short presentation, sorry I don't have any slides to show, is basically some element of experience from Benin in West Africa on the momentum of digitalization and specifically how this COVID-19 crisis has affected the momentum, whatever the way it has changed it. So what I want to say first is that in Benin we created a new momentum for digitalization starting 2016, and we did it, from the top of the state with an action program, a government action program that puts digitalization at the core of the development process. What has happened with COVID-19 is basically that we were put under a lot of pressure to deliver some services, specifically because digitalization has proven to be an option, or has proven to provide options not only to government but also to citizens and to companies. And the way it has benefited us is really to bring some spotlights on how important it is to have a certain level of maturity in terms of digitalization. If I can give you some example, we were confronted to the continuity of the government action within these days of lockdown or of confinement, and we were put under pressure to make sure that cabinet meetings can still happen using the digital tools, and in each sectorial ministry that we still have the management being able to meet with the minister and carry on with the state business. So this was obviously a challenge that we had to face. Another thing, like most of the countries, was about education. Education was a key subject because we had to try to maintain a certain level of education through our schools and universities. In universities, for example, what has been done is that we obviously cancel every courses and presentation with significant number of people, students in the same room, and we had these big sessions with thousands of students in one room, but we have to put them on remote learning and remote teaching using one of the well-known platforms on the market. So again, we became one of the big users, almost overnight, and of these platforms, whether we like it or not. It's not ours. It's a platform which is hosted somewhere in Europe and the US. But again, we were pushed to get to that very quickly, and this has contributed to increase the maturity of digitalization in Benin. And it is important because people have started to do things that they were not doing before. And I believe that they will continue doing at least some of it in the future, going forward. One of the key milestones of what Benin has done and has basically chosen for its development is to say, do we really know our people in the country? are we sure that we can identify these people? Are we sure that we can reach to these people, including in the rural areas, including with people moving around as they've been doing for centuries now? So what we decided to do is to have a digital biometric identification of everybody. And we ran that program, and within 6 months, we had in excess of 10 million Beninese and residents in Benin over a population of about 12 million people. So we have that database, and we're using that database for different purposes. Main one is to make sure that we have the civil identification of the people. So it helped, for example, we discovered in the process, by the way, that we had more than 2 million people with zero identification. And I'm talking about not digital identification, I'm just talking about identification, none of it. And it gave us the opportunity to give birth certificates, digitalized birth certificate to Benin. So these people, as you can guess, are not are not the richest people in Benin. On the contrary, they are in the extreme poor categories of the population in Benin. Now they have an identification, a digital identification. Very quickly at services. We had a plan and we had prepared for that, but we planned to launch it a little bit later. But we were able to launch very quickly on the end of March our e-services portals. And this e-services is services government to citizen. It allows now citizens to get a number of administrative papers directly from the portal the government has put in place without traveling, from the comfort of their home. But also, when I say traveling, I mean it's not from my home to 2 blocks away the municipality office. It's literally tens of kilometers between my home and any government or administrative office. So this was very important, and things like your citizenship documents can now be obtained through this portal. This portal also was very much orientated to providing companies to the documents they need to run their business properly, and they would get that. And the registration of the company, for example, could be obtained from that portal. It's important to get to that, and the identification process, the digital identification process, was key to get that, because obviously some of these documents are very sensitive and very personal to either the people or to the company. Through the digital identification, we were about to get the people to know who we are dealing with online and who we are giving information, who we are getting information from, and who we are giving back a document, a digitalized document, or some other information. So this was very important, and we can do that on a fully secured way with the approval from the authority in charge of protecting the data, the personal data of the citizens. It also gave some potentialities to e-commerce platform. They can now use the digital identification to secure their transaction, whether it's a commerce transaction, whether it's a finance transaction. And we're going further again by putting together a platform that would provide different type of payment and specifically to government institutions through that platform. That platform is not yet operational, but I'm sure that you will hear about that in a few months when it will become fully operational. Commerce, and specifically e-commerce, has very key features that it has to have, and that feature is the confidence in what you are doing in the transaction you are processing. And digital is not different than that. We have to build that security and that confidence that the people and the companies would trust when they are using these services. And for that, we are also building our PKI platform in order to assist not only in securing the identification, the identity of people through national identity cards, passports, but also for commercial transactions and financial transactions in the country. So what I want to finish on is the fact that, yes, digitalization is a process. It's not an easy process in Africa because the level of maturity, and it goes with a lot of training, a lot of very basic training sometimes. It goes with also the endpoints that have to be present. If you don't have a smartphone, if you don't have a laptop, if you don't have a tablet, then basically you are out of the system. And we're working on all that. What COVID-19 has given us, which is positive, and I acknowledge all the hardship around the COVID-19, but which is positive is that it has forced us to increase significantly the level of the maturity of digitalization in the country. And through that, we will see a number of consequences in terms of people, a larger number of people using digital tools, but also the commerce within the country, but also with other countries on other commerce platforms increasing significantly. So this is what I wanted to share with you to start with. Thank you very much.
Mr. Ajavi, thank you very much for that very informative and fascinating presentation. I must say, from my perspective, a couple of takeaways for me were, firstly, the importance of consultation, and that's something certainly that we are seeing both in the work at UNCITRAL and the development of text, but in particular at the technical assistance side, the need to bring on board all the populations that will be affected by it. And secondly, that need for digital education and awareness. Certainly, I think something that we can all be reminded of, including myself at the UNCITRAL Secretariat, about exactly what's there, what's available, and how it's used. So I will now proceed with the next panelist. We have Mr. Dongwon Choi from the Republic of Korea joining us. Mr. Choi is the Director of the Cybersecurity Planning Division within the Ministry of Science and ICT of the Republic of Korea. He previously served as Director of the Public Relations Division, as well as the Director of Cyber Threat Response Division. He was involved in the amendment of the Act on the Protection of Information and Communications Infrastructure and the development of the Personal Information and Information Security Management System, Korea's highest and most comprehensive data protection management and privacy certification systems for enterprises. So with that, it gives me great pleasure to hand the floor to you, Mr. Choi, for your presentation. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure to take part in this webinar. It's fortunate that we can have experts can get together to seek wise solutions to COVID-19 crisis. I will explain the Digital Signature Act, which has been revised recently. With the advancement in IT, we are seeing the spread of digital culture in the. However, in spite of the COVID-19 outbreak, the transition to the contact-free society has been accelerated. Thanks to the practice of social distancing measures and isolation. In sectors such as education, business activities, and administration, where there has not been much of online activities before. Now, we are seeing the expansion of contact-with services throughout those industries. This expansion of contact-with services is not a one-off event, but is expected to be spread throughout our society as a new paradigm. We spread of contact service, the importance of trustworthiness and security of digital signature, which is a way of identification and authentication in the digital world, has grown. In the amended version of the Digital Signature Act, recently revised by the Ministry of Science and ICT, measures has been reflected the provide support for safe authentication in the society's digital signature. First, let me explain the background on how the Digital Signature Act has been amended. In the early stage of Internet deployment in Korea, Digital Signature Act has been enacted in 1999, and public key certificate system has been adopted in order to promote online services such as administration, finance, and e-commerce, and guarantee safety and trustworthiness of e-commerce. Over the past 20 years, public key certificate system has been used by many Koreans as the measure to identify individuals in the digital world and verify the authenticity of digital documents. The public key certificate system has contributed to the public key certificate system has enjoyed a and monopolistic time. There has lack of innovation, causing inconvenience for users in having to install ActiveX controls and limited access to digital signature of emerging technologies. This has led to increased demand for revoking public key certificates from Korean people. The Korean government has collected the feedback from multiple stakeholders and revised them and took measures such as implementing hackathon for reconstructing public key certificate system in 2018 as a part of effort to answer the call of citizens to revoke public key certificates. Digital Signature Act has been amended in this year, which include revoking public key certificate system and promoting digital signature in the area of emerging technologies. As a result of autonomous competition of multiple market players. The key contents of the Digital Signature Act are as follows. First, public key certificate system no longer has superior legal effect than other laws in the revised Digital Signature Act. The evaluation and accreditation system to determine whether signature authentication protocols are abided by has been introduced. The standard for operating digital signature authentication process has been established by taking into account of internationally recognized standards in order to increase trustworthiness of digital signature means and provide information for users to ensure they make rational choices. The evaluation and accreditation system will be operated by private evaluation and accreditation agencies and will be operated as a certification system based on the voluntary application of digital signature authentication providers. Third, digital signature authentication providers are obliged to set an identification guidance and establish certification protocols The amended Digital Signature Act stipulates accredited digital signature authentication providers to establish and comply with the procedures and methods of our identification and digital signature certification protocols. For the responsibility of digital signature authentication providers that has been issued certificate has been stipulated. In the case of damages in incurred to users of digital signature authentication, a system for digital signature authentication providers to compensate for damages has been established. With the amendment made to the Digital Signature Act, many changes will take place in the Internet user environment of Korea. The use of digital signature in various emerging technologies, such as blockchain and biometric technology, will be further promoted as to respond to the increased use of contactless services. Safer and more convenient digital signatures will be launched to make market throughout increased competition among different methods of digital signatures. Contactless services on the industries, including administration, healthcare, and education, will be supported and improved in a way that is easier to use. In response to the infectious disease like the COVID outbreak, the Korean government is stepping up efforts to create a zero contact environment where inconvenience experienced by citizens in their daily lives can be minimized by advancing digital signature services. Contactless services will be provided to people working from home due to self-isolation and group activities such as religious gatherings and networking events. This will enable members of the community to avoid feeling disconnected from relationships due to isolation. In addition, the measures will be taken continuously for basic living rights to be guaranteed amid the pandemic. By, by actively supporting essential activities of general public, such as healthcare and education, we will make sure to take further improved solutions and share them with other countries based on the countermeasures and policy directions of the international community discussed today. Thank you.
Mr. Choi, thank you so much for that very informative update on recent legislative developments in Korea. And just picking up on your last point in terms of sharing that experience with others, I'm sure that from what we've seen with focuses on electronic transactions law in the last few months, that many states would be interested to take up that offer to hear from the lessons learned from Korea in terms of that, dare I characterize as opening up of the legislative regime for electronic signatures. Particularly, we find very interesting, in view of the current work that we're doing on legal issues related to the digital economy, is the use of blockchain biometric systems and the use of other technology for digital signatures and authentication. So I thank you for that very timely and interesting intervention for us. Now, the next panelist we have is Carla Vazquez-Valas. And before I introduce Ms. Vazquez, can I ask kindly for all other panelists to mute their lines? We are getting a bit of feedback on the line. Just check. I think we are. I think we do have mute. So thank you very much. Ms. Carla Vazquez-Valas is the co-founder of JW Legal Innovation, a legal tech firm that helps small and medium-sized enterprises increase their value through digital transformation and empowers the evolution of law as a catalyst for digital inclusion and economic growth in law in Latin America. Ms. Vasquez-Balach is a lawyer with 2 postgraduate degrees in commercial law and public international law, with further studies in electronic communications, electronic signatures, and e-commerce legal frameworks, all very topical for today's discussions. During her 20 years professional experience, Ms. Vasquez has held different positions across the private and public sectors. As General Deputy Director of Business Policy at the Ministry of Economy of Mexico, she successfully implemented different legal reforms on business simplification and operation. She also led the renegotiation of the electronic signature provisions of the Mexico-EU Free Trade Agreement and the digital agenda of the Pacific Alliance, achieving inclusion of cross-border recognition of trust services. And it's on that last point that we are particularly interested to have Ms. Vasquez's intervention, given that what we're seeing is a greater focus on electronic signatures and cross-border recognition in the digital trade context. So with that, I'm delighted to pass the floor over to Ms. Vasquez to present. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Alexander, Luke. It's an honor to be here and share this panel with all the experts. Thanks for the opportunity, and I would like to share with you some important aspects that in the private sector point of view, as a legal firm in this challenging activity that I am now doing, because it's different when you work from a public perspective, and then when you go to private sector, you confront different challenges. And you have to go with the problematics that a company has in the day-to-day. So identification and authentication in the digital economy is a very important issue that actually is discussed in the general context of company. But first, and perhaps you already know, in Latin America, we are not dealing so good with the COVID pandemic. I was looking at the last prediction of Luis Alberto Moreno, the ADB group. He said that the region will experience a deep recession because of the COVID pandemic. So we have a lot of challenges. We have to rethink our daily life, from work to school to entertainment. All our life is completely have a new life. Given the highly contagious nature of the coronavirus, countries have been forced to resort to extreme measures, including quarantines, lockdowns, and widespread business closures. Companies are trying to continuity and to fulfill commitments with clients, with employees, with suppliers, with vendors, with partners. It's a huge challenge for companies. And more challenging is that in Latin America, we have almost 90% of our companies are micro, small, and enterprise. So that's another factor that it's in the game. And in the public sector, the public administration has to ensure continuity of the services. So if we analyze from the private sector perspective and the public sector perspective, there are huge challenges for Latin America. Both sectors are considering how to function online, and how to function online. It includes to have this environment, electronic environment that combines legal certainty and security. So Mexico, how are we doing in digital experience? Well, almost 10 years ago, we initiate a digital strategy, a national digital strategy. We have implemented the model of electronic signatures and also the electronic commerce in our legal framework. But if I am truly honest with you, because of a culture aspect, companies and government won't give the importance of digital environment since 2000. The main efforts that we have done on digital transformation have been done 5 years ago. For example, an important single window where companies can fully incorporate in online basis with no fee associate and no notaries included in this process. It's a policy and a legal reform that has been done since 2016. So before that, companies didn't have another option that go fully the traditional process paper basis. Another important digital advance, and it looks like it provoked several additional electronic policies, was the e-invoice that our tax authority implemented in 2017. So that leader aspect really helps now that companies are really more confident in using electronic means. And now, because of the problematic that represent this social distance, companies, our clients, are asking us, how can I go through electronic with legal certainty and with the confidence that my contract, my document that I will sign electronically will have the same effect that those that I use on paper. So in a general context, in Mexico, we already have all the legal framework of, as I said, the electronic signatures. And of course, the evidence to formation of contracts and intention of the party equivalent to the wet ink signature, it's already there. But now the question is, which kind of electronic signature should I use? And that's another huge debate in the community because we have token electronic signatures. We have like a PIN electronic signatures. Perhaps a pen in our mobile device or in our computer. Also, we have PKI infrastructure in Mexico that public sector and tax authorities give additional recognition because it's a electronic advanced signature. So there's a common misunderstanding that there's only one type of electronic signature that could be used in Mexico with legal effect, that it's PKI infrastructure, and that's not right. So as a legal firm, we have to get orientated companies and give them the sufficient elements to decide which method is the method that really is light of the circumstances of the operation that he has to do. we have to include a very strict analysis about the type of document that they are going to sign. We have to allow that this kind of electronic signature help me to identify the parties, and both parties manifest their consent to the use of the electronic signature. And of course, all our clients are very worried that the documents that cannot execute electronic will be executed electronically. If I go to a judge, it will be effective, will be interpreted as a legal document. So that's the challenges that we face when we are in these crucial circumstances with COVID challenges. But I realized that the commercial sector, the private sector, now is very, very interested in go through the use of electronic signatures and electronic ID identification. Last, I would like to share with you also this effort that Mexico and Chile, Peru, and Colombia made with Pacific Alliance, because it's an important effort that it's going through. It's not done, but they are willing to make this complete integration, because they, as a level of a member mandate, they established that there will be an electronic signature cross-border recognition between the 4 countries. And it was something easy to do because the 4 countries have a PKI infrastructure. But it doesn't mean, and this is very important, it doesn't mean that doesn't recognize other kind of methods of electronic signatures. But governments will interact with this cross-border recognition, for example, in custom issues or documents that will be transferring some information for importers, exporters. So this is a important photo and regional integration that it's good to know that we as a country are willing to do. So that's the general context of what's happening in Mexico regarding electronic signatures. And of course, if there's a question, I will be delighted to answer it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carla, for that presentation, which just avoided me having to use the bell. So I'm delighted, but also delighted for the overview of the fact that I suppose the disconnect between, well, not the disconnect, but the lag between the legal developments and the actual putting into practice within the business community. And also for that overview of what's happening at this moment within the Pacific Alliance. Again, if I may, before we introduce the next panelist, just a couple of takeaways I have from that, both the technology neutrality, the importance of technology neutrality that you mentioned with your references and questioning of the attention to PKI, as well as, and this picks up on something that Serge said earlier about the education. So when I understand from Mr. Adjovi's contribution about the education of the general public in bringing in a digital ID scheme, we also see the need, of course, to educate the business community in the use of these electronic tools in their business practices. So that's thank you very much. I hope I'm correct in those takeaways. What we will do now is I am very mindful that we still have waiting very patiently, and again, apologies to Andrea Savida, our first panelist, due to some technical issues with the sound. What I would like to do is to pass the floor now back to Andrea Savita to see how we go with the microphone. But I'm afraid if we still have problems with the microphone, what we might need to do is to stop the presentation and then move on to our final panelist for the time being. So Andrea, I give the floor to you with my fingers crossed that everything's okay with the mic at your end.
Okay, I hope you can hear me now.
We are absolutely delighted.
Okay, and
thank you so much.
You're very welcome. I apologize really for all the problems that we have gone through before, and I try now to go back to my presentation, which I hope you can see. So first of all, I would like really to thank UNCITRAL for organizing the event. As I said earlier, I hope you heard it, and for the work that you have been doing to promote the adoption of digital technology to support trust, confidence, and predictability, legal predictability, which are key ingredients for global trade. In this respect, what I would like to do today is just to share what is indeed the European perspective, which to some extent I would say builds on longer than 20 years, I would say, effort to introduce digital tools. We started back in the 90s with the directive on 99 on electronic signatures. And before that, we had a number of projects of working on I would say, interoperability of electronic signatures and PKI-related technologies to make digital certificates to help transactions. I remember when I joined the Commission in 93, actually one of the first projects in 94 was about bill aiding in the maritime domain. And, this goes back, some 27 years. So why I'm saying this? Because, for one reason, I think that, of course, we have to be all, I would say, aware of how difficult the confinement, the crisis related to COVID-19 was for the entire world, for people, for mankind. But I must say that in this domain, COVID did much more in a few weeks, in a couple of months, than perhaps might have done in terms we might have achieved in 20 years of pushing. And I'm saying this not because, of course, things happen overnight. As I said, we have a legal framework on electronic signature in Europe since 21 years. And we have actually since 2016 the EADAS regulation, which has been an enhancement of the legal framework to indeed make even more operational and more usable electronic signature, electronic seals, electronic registered delivery services, timestamping, electronic identification, which had been in the past. But, changing the mind of people, changing the habit. You have been talking about colleagues before about educating the business. It is about indeed educating the business, and let's not forget in Europe we have about a bit lower than 30 million small and medium enterprises in Europe, and in the country where the country where I come from, we have a 98% in terms of numbers organizations that are very small enterprises. Of course, this shows. This to say that I would say legal frameworks can help, technology certainly helps, but then is the education and the understanding of what is indeed that it is available to us that makes things to change their habit. And to some extent, the COVID and the announcement that I show here in my slides do indeed pertain to those push that we had received during the confinement to go digital, because digital was the only solution. I'm saying this because, of course, in the 20 years plus and since 2016 in Europe, we have been pushing in regulatory frameworks, and here just give you a bit of a snapshot, where we have pushed the adoption of electronic signature, for instance, electronic seals, but also electronic identifications, which in Europe is indeed recognized across border and has legal value up to the level of in-person verification of the identity of the person that is relying on such electronic identification means, which are notified under the others regulation. Despite the pushing of this, the resistance, I would say, attitude not to change, because digital is a mysterious word, was such that all the activities that we have done to modify the anti-money laundering directive, to modify the payment service directive, to modify the company law regulation, to make, for instance, companies to be able to rely in a way that is legally predictable and enforceable across the jurisdiction, because Europe is a region. We are not, I would say, a federal union. We are a union, so member states retain their responsibilities. A lot of the competences, in particular in the area of electronic identity, reside in the sovereign stays under sovereign responsibility of the member states. But nonetheless, Andrea Servida is an Italian citizen, is a European citizen. He has been working in Italy, he has been working in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in the UK, and he has the right to be able to conduct his organization, his transactions, and complete his duties in a way that is seamless, secure, trustworthy, and frictionless. And this is what we have there. You see there the once only principle cross-border. We have in Europe the first legislation that allows a citizen and a company to conclude a number of procedures in a way that will we can indeed provide, or I would say we can make the evidence that are needed for the conclusion of a procedure, like changing the residency or in a country, to rely on the automatic, I would say, fetching of data at the request of the user, with the consent of the user, based on the roaming of the electronic identification from one country to another. I'm Belgian, I'm Italian, I live in Belgium. If I want to change my I would say, my residence, and I need to provide a certificate about my age, for instance, or about my marital status or whatever, I can, as of 2023, activate a technical system that will empower the administration in Belgium with my mandate to make a request in the countries, in Italy, where my authentic data are about my birth are indeed stored, to fetch those data, which will be checked by me and will be provided to the public administration under my control. And this is possible because the identity that I can use online to authenticate to the authority in Belgium is indeed recognized, because it's issued, or is indeed, I would say, guaranteed, if I may say so, from the Italian government. I think that this is where we were heading. This is the vision. But to get there, indeed, as I said, if we didn't have, I would say, these unfortunate crises, we would have been much, I would say, more behind. Why? Because it is only when we were confined. We have seen that, indeed, as the colleagues before said, that digital is an opportunity. Digital is a way to remain free despite the confinement, is a way to make ourselves, to exercise our rights and our obligations in a way that is fully compliant. And this is why, we in Europe, we want even to go beyond. Of course, as I said, the others regulation provide the legal framework, but as it had been, I would say, alluded to in previous presentation, there is nothing like a legal framework which is not supported by a technological infrastructure. We are talking about digital. We are talking about not a single way of doing things, but we are talking about federated solutions, because nobody may, indeed, I would say, like to define in a multi-jurisdictional region like Europe what should or may be the identity of a person. The identity in my country is notionally different from the identity in Sweden or I would say in Austria. Nevertheless, while we are all, I would say, citizens that have rights, obligation, and possibility to exercise our freedoms across the different countries. And of course, the others has put the foundational element. But what we see even more emerging is how digital identity and electronic signature could be used, for instance, to complete in a very automatic way steps like know your customers procedure under the anti-money laundering directive or customer due diligence under the anti-laundering directive. And once it's done in country A for banks, whatever, everything that is related to the identity can be roamed from one country to another country. This is what we have done as an activity in the context of this digital onboarding portability KYC. Why this is important? Because if indeed we can make it in regulatory framework like the one related to banking and payments, then we are reaching what is indeed very close to the experience of our citizens. And that is the lesson learned that we have indeed, I would say, very much, I would say, learned through the years, which makes, at the political level, even more urgent to go even beyond what has been, I would say, the original ambition of the others regulation and try to operationalize the trust anchor that we have in the regulation in order to come up with something that will make citizens and businesses, because let's not forget the electronic, the others regulation covers in relation to electronic identification, both private citizens and businesses. So any sort of identification which might be associated to the, I would say, to legal entities which are registered in Europe. So the vision is the one of providing a European digital identity that will make it possible for citizens to be even more empowered than they are today in relation to few things: minimizing the data which might have to be shared or which might have to be provided in order to fulfill authentication or identification purposes which are needed to conduct a transaction. This is very much the case, for instance, in any value-related transaction, but not only. Also in any transaction that might be associated to management of sensitive data. Could it be something related to health? Could it be something related to the exercise of rights or obligation that we have as a citizen of a country? And of course, I mean, to do this, we need to be up to what is indeed that the technology allow us to do, which is indeed make it possible to manage only those credentials, those properties, those attributes that makes the interaction, the secure interaction or the secure authentication possible. If in order to get access to some service, I need to prove my age or being of an age that is above a certain threshold, and I need to prove that I'm a European citizen, and I need to prove that I'm, I would say, a chartered engineer, I don't need to disclose what is my gender. I don't need to disclose where I was born. I don't need to disclose where indeed I'm registered or where I live. And I think that is where we have indeed this motto that indeed digital identity should speak for us and not about us. It should provide the digital identity. It should be managed as the, I would say, the channel, or I would say as the means that allow us to serve the purpose of providing those information which are needed to the transaction. For instance, to the extreme, we can think that once we have done, for instance, a KYC in Europe, in a jurisdiction where there is an overarching legal framework which makes the KYC to be applicable in the same way, more or less, I would say, with some caveats across the 27 member states. what is related to identity, which means to the person, not the risk profile, which is more related to the way in which activities or services may be offered. Once I've done the KYC to open a bank account in country A, I should be entitled to allow the credential, yes, you have the KYC, to be shared with another bank, which will actually could enforce the KYC that I'm relying upon should something goes wrong. There is no point for me to provide the same type of information to open a bank account, in country A and country B. I'm proved to be the right Andrea Servida, which is legitimately, I would say, recognized to have all the identity-related attributes that are needed in order to open a bank account. Then I should, yes, use a kind of a yes, trusted yes, which could be ported because of the identification roaming. So I can identify myself in Sweden, in Italy, in France, in Spain, in the UK, in the same way as I do identify myself online in Europe. I think that is important because the convenience part is a safeguard for security. The convenience, at least in this respect, is where indeed we need to be working. And this is where, and I come 30 seconds to what is the view, the ahead. The ahead is indeed, I would say, to push even more towards, I would say, verifiable credential and the need to make a technology to support the provisioning of attributes and credentials which are associated to verified identities, which of course the others can indeed, I would say very much provide in Europe. And that is perhaps a model that we are indeed promoting very much at international level. Of course, at the UNCITRAL, you're very much aware of it because the colleagues, I've started myself, but the colleagues are continuing, but we are doing also at the WTO level and in international initiatives like the Financial Action Task Force. Why? Because here we are talking about digital to be a tool, a means to make citizen businesses much more capable of expressing themselves and accessing in a secure, accountable, transparent, and predictable way services that otherwise might indeed, I would say, just be provided with a bit of, I would say, unclarity. Last words, I would point to this study that the ETSI, so the European Standardization Body, has done on the PKI-based trust services, because they have toured the world to see what is indeed that is up there and how indeed a global trust can be built. And with this, I conclude my presentation. Thank you very much for your time.
Andrea, thank you very much for that presentation. Again, apologies, and thank you very much for your flexibility. In a way, I'm glad that we had your presentation just now, because it is a very nice segue into our next panelist, Thomas Smedinghoff, who will pick up on the discussions, looking forward to perhaps future work within Working Group 4 and other types of global efforts in the area of electronic identification. Before doing so, I suppose the two things ring for me there is we take note of the electronic ID speaking for us and not about us. I think that's a nice little mantra. And I suppose the other thing for us to all be aware of is what electronic ID does for transforming transactions and ease of business. That's certainly another takeaway. So I will. With that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our final panelist, Thomas Smedinghoff. He is of counsel at the US law firm Lock Lord, based in Chicago. Mr. Smedinghoff's practice focuses on information law and electronic business activities, where he advises on emerging legal issues regarding electronic transactions, identity management, privacy, information security, and online authentication. He is also actively involved in developing legislation and public policy in the areas of electronic business at state and national level within the United States. Moreover, he has served as an advisor to the US delegation to UNCITRAL, where he participated in negotiating the United Nations Convention on the Use of Electronic Communications in International Contracts, and in developing the model law on electronic transferable records. Most recently, he has served as an expert engaged by the UNCITRAL Secretariat in its work supporting the current text being developed by Working Group 4 on identity management and trust services, on which we may hear about a little bit more about very soon. I should add that last year Mr. Smedinghoff was recognised as a thought leader in data law by Who's Who Legal for his extensive experience in data privacy, protection, security and technology, media and telecommunications matters. Now, before handing over the floor to Mr. Smedinghoff, I just want to remind states who are in the room who would like to make an intervention after the panellists to please do so by identifying the state name in the Q&A section, which will be activated during Mr. Smedinghoff's presentation. So with that housekeeping matter, I'm delighted to present Mr. Smedinghoff. Please, Tom, you have the floor.
Thank you, Alex. And my thanks to the Secretariat for the opportunity to present today. I would like to focus on the subject of identity management, and in particular on three things. First, I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about the role of private sector identity management systems, generally in e-commerce as well as in responding to the COVID issues. Secondly, I'd like to talk about the importance of a governance framework to the operation of identity systems. And then thirdly, I'd like to talk about the opportunity and the challenge, I guess, for UNCITRAL to provide the sort of missing part of the overall legal framework that's required for identity systems to operate effectively and to flourish in the marketplace. Let me start with just a clarification on two terms that I'll be using: identity management and identity management systems. Identity management is a set of processes and procedures that really focus on two basic questions. You know, who are you? That's the identification part. And how can you prove it? Or in other words, how can you prove that the information about a particular person relates specifically to you, particularly when you are operating remotely? And that's the authentication part of the process. And for identity management systems, I think it's important to recognize that an identity management system involves a group of participating entities, all acting in accordance with a set of rules, and that set of rules is the governance framework that I'll talk about in a few minutes. And they utilize a set of processes, policies, and procedures that are specified in those rules for the purpose of either providing or using identity management services whereby an individual can identify himself, typically remotely, to any number of unaffiliated entities. If you look at the global passport system, that's perhaps an example of an identity management system with passports issued by various countries that are then relied upon by other countries for purposes of allowing individuals entry into the country. It's also analogous to the credit card system, where you have numerous different players participating in an overall system, in that case for purposes of granting credit, but you've got a large number of parties globally all acting in accordance with the uniform set of rules to process those credit transactions. Identity management is important, of course, for its role in remote electronic commerce, particularly things like signatures, e-contracting, online access, and so forth. I would like to emphasize also that it's very, very important for data security purposes, as granting access to anyone to a system obviously requires that you know who that person is and what they are allowed to do. But the COVID pandemic that we are currently dealing with has really accelerated the need for remote identity management. I think almost all of the speakers have really already made this point. In fact, I've been working from home for the past several months. It really is becoming the new norm in many cases, and so much more is being done remotely because we really need to. And so the overall push for electronic commerce that we have seen in the past is only getting accelerated by the COVID challenge that we're seeing. We're also seeing that COVID is introducing new identity requirements, and there's been a lot of discussion, and of course there are many privacy and data protection issues to be resolved, but there's much talk about the need for new data attributes about an individual, such as whether they have tested negative or positive, whether they have the COVID antibodies and so forth, as well as discussion regarding credentials that might, for example, certify that a particular individual has tested negative or is otherwise COVID-free. And of course, over the next months, we will see many more discussions regarding these kinds of issues, but it really emphasizes the need for adaptability in identity systems. Generally, I would say the private sector is in a unique position to provide identity systems generally for purposes of e-commerce and other electronic activities. It's really leading the way in developing a variety of different types of systems to support different types of economic activities. It's experimenting with all kinds of different models, including a variety of user-centric models designed to allow the individual to control the data for his or her own identity and so forth. So from many respects, the private sector is leading the way, and I think ultimately will be the primary source of identity and identity transactions for the purposes of e-commerce. It obviously will never replace government foundational identity, but from a commercial perspective, the private sector, I think, will really be the key driving force. Similarly, we're seeing the same with respect to the COVID issues. I think the private sector is typically going to be best able to react quickly to the challenges with the adaptability and the flexibility and the speed that's needed to do that. And as an example, I would point to the COVID-19 Credentials Initiative that's currently underway to try to deal with those issues on an international basis. And it's an initiative that's really open to anyone, as far as I'm aware. But the challenge with any identity system is that it's a complex multi-party system. And again, think about the credit card systems that you're familiar with, or the payment systems. They involve multiple participants and multiple roles that need to be filled. And they involve numerous and often critical processes of identification, authentication, encryption, and so forth that need to be accomplished and need to be accomplished correctly. So in order to put together an identity system, there needs to be a basis upon which to coordinate the activities of all of the participants and, in effect, make sure they do the right thing at the right time. And the solution that we see there, both in the public sector and in the private sector, is what I will refer to here as a governance framework. A governance framework is nothing more than a written set of rules. It's uniquely designed for a specific identity system. And those rules address the business, technical, and legal issues necessary to the operation of that identity system. And most importantly, those rules are legally binding on all of the participants in the identity system. discussion. You may have seen the term governance framework, but it's also referred to by several other terms, including trust framework, SKI rules, operating rules, system rules, and so forth. But again, it's analogous to the rules that the credit card systems or the payment systems operate under today. Its purpose is first and foremost to coordinate all of the different parts and pieces and entities involved so that they operate correctly, so that the system functions. But it also serves to define the rights and responsibilities of the participants. And most importantly, from an e-commerce perspective, or really from any perspective, the purpose of a governance framework is to make sure that the specific system is considered trustworthy for the purpose for which it is set up. So that's going beyond merely functional and kind of stepping it up to the level necessary to be considered trustworthy by the people who would use it. Now, where do governance frameworks come from? In public sector systems, they are typically set out in statutes. The Aadhaar Act in India, the Identity Documents Act in Estonia, the IDES regulation in the EU are all examples of public sector statutes or regulations that fill that role. In the private sector, of course, it's done by contract. I've set out here some examples of various trust frameworks or governance frameworks that are available on the internet. But again, the parties have to agree to those by contract in order to participate in the system. This is just a quick overview of the types of issues that a governance framework might address. And I've grouped them into business and technical issues on the left and legal, contractual-based legal issues on the right. And again, in a private sector system, the participants would agree to these would agree to the governance framework setting out these rules as necessary for the role that the participant is filling. So what we have, though, is a key issue with respect to the overall legal framework, and that is that the governance framework that governs a particular identity system must comply with existing law, just like any contract must comply with existing law. So at the bottom of this slide, I included 3 boxes representing the governance frameworks of 3 different identity systems. And just to emphasize that each of those contract-based governance frameworks has to comply with whatever existing law applies in that case, including tort law, privacy law, any COVID restrictions if it's involved in that processing, and so forth. But it's sort of just a basic fact that any contract needs to comply with existing law. The problem for online remote identity systems, private sector identity systems, is that existing law also raises a number of problems that they have to deal with. In some cases, it presents barriers to what they want to do. In other cases, ambiguities that make the application of existing law somewhat unclear in the context of an identity system. Some cases, rules may be inappropriate, or in some cases, they may literally be prohibited from doing what they want to do. So I think the challenge for UNCITRAL is to develop an instrument that recognizes that each of these private sector identity systems is different and unique and needs to be governed by its own governance framework. So this instrument that UNCITRAL would develop needs to address any problems that existing law creates for identity systems that cannot be addressed via their own governance framework. And it's that sort of gap that is really critical in addressing here. So that the bottom line is the UNCITRAL instrument needs to facilitate flexible and adaptable governance frameworks for a variety of different identity systems solutions in the private sector. It needs to allow the private sector to experiment and to work out whatever needs it has and whatever system will address those needs that are best for its particular circumstances. So what UNCITRAL is working on and needs to really finish is the middle level in this chart. It's some sort of instrument that will help states develop identity systems law that fills the gap between what governance frameworks do best and do best for the unique type of system that they are developing and the problems that are caused by existing law. And it's filling that gap, which can help facilitate the operation of governance frameworks for different identity systems and really help promote online identification and promote the e-commerce and online activity that we would like to encourage. So it's critical that each governance framework in each unique identity system work out for itself what rules are appropriate, and it's only where it can't do that, basically, or it needs help from an intervening law, which I call identity systems law, that the UNCITRAL instrument would help fill in that gap in this kind of a process. And just to conclude, in the last slide, I've just listed some of the types of things that the UNCITRAL instrument might address, some of the types of issues that seem to be coming up with identity systems that cannot completely be addressed by the governance framework that those systems put together. And of course, stating these is much easier than working out the solution to many of these issues, and there are presumably several others, but it's filling that gap that I think offers both a challenge but an opportunity for UNCITRAL to come up with sort of the missing piece on the legal framework that's necessary for private sector identity systems, recognizing that it's really the private sector identity systems that are going to facilitate much of the commercial activities that we see today. So with that, I will conclude my remarks and turn it back to you, Alex. Thank you.
Tom, thank you very much. And that last point, I think, is something for us to bear in mind in this next section on perhaps on that states may wish to address, or people from the floor in the Q&A function. So again, thank you very much, Tom, for that very interesting presentation. So now is the time for us to move from the panel session to the state intervention session. With that, I'm delighted to pass the floor back to you, Chair, to invite those states who have expressed an interest to do so. I see that we have a number of states that have already requested to take the floor, and I invite you to call on them individually.
Thank you, Alex. But I would like first to thank to each panelist for their interesting and illustrative presentation. Saying that, I would like now to open the floor for state interventions. I have on my list the distinguished representative of Chile. Chile has asked the floor, please. Chile.
Thank you. Can you hear me, please?
Yes, perfectly.
Good, because we have had some problems before. Thank you, Chair, for giving me the floor. Let me first congratulate the Secretary for organizing this series of webinars, which we are sure will demonstrate the relevance of UNCITRAL legislative tools in the economic recovery efforts of countries and powers affected by the COVID pandemic. The topic of the webinar, this webinar in particular, is very relevant for the international trade actors of our country and region, and others for our small and medium enterprises. For them to be able to use online sales platforms for their transactions is very important, and more so in the current circumstances, and that those transactions are done in a safe and secure environment. As was mentioned by Mrs. Carla Vázquez, digital economy is also an issue that is being discussed within the Pacific Alliance, and if I'm not wrong, also CEPAL. We can see that what the panelists have told us today will be useful also for the discussions that are taking place in the Working Group 4 on the Commission on Electronic Commerce. Thank you. Thank you again, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. And now I will pass the floor to the representative of Singapore.
Good day. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Firstly, we would like to congratulate and thank the UNCITRAL Secretariat for organizing this series of virtual panels. It is a clear demonstration of the relevance of the UNCITRAL's work in helping economies around the world in dealing with this new situation where digital work and digital transactions have taken on a much greater prominence. On our part, we agree that electronic identification and authentication play an important role in electronic transactions, and especially so in cross-border transactions. And in many economies and societies, COVID-19 has actually pushed us into adopting digital ways of carrying on these transactions. We note that UNCITRAL has already contributed various legal texts such as the Model Laws on Electronic Commerce, Electronic Signature, and the Electronic Communications Convention, and these all contain provisions relating to electronic signatures. In Singapore, we have enacted the Electronic Communications Convention in our Electronic Transactions Act. These existing laws in Singapore supporting electronic transactions gave businesses and other persons the confidence to transact electronically, which was especially important during the COVID-19 pandemic, and when public health restrictions were implemented. Having the legal framework and the technology systems in place was invaluable in facilitating transactions and trade for both businesses and consumers, including older consumers and small businesses, which might not have adopted technology solutions. We note also that the UNCITRAL's Working Group 4 is currently undertaking work in preparing a legal text that seeks to promote cross-border use of identification and trust services. And this resulting work from the current work is intended to add to the existing texts that UNCITRAL had already produced. Perhaps this COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the potential contribution that this current work can have to the digital economy. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for your comments. Now I will give the floor to the distinguished representative of Italy. Italy, you have the floor, please. Gisela, I don't know if you can hear me. You have the floor. I will pass you the floor. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. If I may, I will just relay the gist of the question that we had received from the delegates of Italy, and that is a question regarding the change of political position of member states in the European Union, particularly in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. If I may, Chair, I think that's a question for the panelists, and if you're happy, you can ask them to. And I might just add there that I think this is relevant not only to the European Union context, but follows on from the intervention from Carla about the work on in the Alianza del Pacifico. So perhaps both of them might have interest in saying something. So perhaps first, Andrea.
Please. Yes, Carla. Who wants to take the floor? Carla, maybe you can have the floor right now and comment about this question just made by Alex.
Yes, Carla, I can just repeat it for you. Essentially, it was a question about whether you see any change in the political position of, and I'll be broader here, of states in general towards these issues in view of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thanks, Alexander. Well, it definitely COVID shows us the vulnerability of our economic system. So I think only with collaborative and coordination actions between countries, we will strengthen regional recovery. There's no other way to achieve that. So as a view from the private sector, I think it will be common sense to maintain this collaboration between the countries.
May I come in?
Yes, please. You have the floor.
Okay. Thank you very much. As I understand that the question was also in relation to the member states in Europe. What I can say is that to some extent the member states were pushed to take up their responsibility. In a sense, the demand side, which has always been very, very difficult to, I would say, appreciate, has become more and more powerful because there has been really demand from businesses, citizens, and of course member states had to follow. In this respect, for instance, I'm based in Belgium, but not very far from here is Luxembourg. They quickly introduced a law to make the operation at the management board of companies to become fully digital, because it was the only way in which they could organize, they could make the business to continue their operation. And we see the member states being willing indeed to second, or I would say to follow the demand for more digital services in a way that has been really unprecedented. So this is where, in my presentation, there is a quote from the Council of Telecommunication Council where there is a clear commitment, it was adopted in June, to really go even beyond along the line of what I think has been said, I would say, just now by Tom, with the link, the engagement, and I would say, the group cooperation with private sector.
Thank you.
May I comment as well?
Yes, please, Tom, you can have the floor.
Yes, just briefly, and maybe this is more anecdotal evidence, but we are getting a large number of inquiries from private sector clients who never really pay much attention to a number of these electronic issues, who now are almost panicking in terms of wanting to do things electronically, and of course asking us, is it legal and how do we do it? But just an incredible increase in interest in remote business transactions. So I think that there's going to be a strong push from the private sector, and that may have an impact on states as well.
Thank you, Tom. And now I will give the floor to the representative of the United States. Please, the representative of the United States has the floor.
Thank you. Hopefully you can hear me?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
Oh, okay, great. Well, first of all, let me thank the Secretariat for the work in putting together these webinars, including today's webinar, and to all the panelists who I think gave really excellent, diverse, helpful, and sort of concrete presentations about the issues that digital identity presents, and particularly in light of COVID. I'll keep my remarks short, as I know that there are a number of others that would like to intervene and provide their thoughts. I think one of the things that this presentation highlighted was the challenges that are faced when trying to establish rules to govern digital identity management systems at the national level. And that, I think, is something we should keep in mind as we think about trying to do it at the global level, including at UNCITRAL. And I think the representative from Singapore made a really helpful point that in this time of COVID, there may be even more of a desire to try to find ways to address these issues, and we should sort of keep these challenges in mind. As Mr. Smedinghoff's presentation highlighted, there are a number of questions that need to be answered that relate to the relationship between government-imposed legal requirements for digital identity management and government-issued identification on the one hand, and the activities and arrangements of private sector identity management providers on the other hand. While a lot of the webinars that we'll be seeing this week and next deal with existing UNCITRAL texts, Working Group 4 is in a unique position in that we're still considering how to address digital identity management in the context of UNCITRAL. And so our hope is that a lot of the questions and issues that were raised today will be integrated into those discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your comments. And now I will give the floor to the Russian delegation. Please, you have the floor.
Everyone?
Yes,
can you hear me? Yes, thank you very much. I would like to thank all the panelists for their presentations, and it's very helpful. And it was especially a great pleasure to hear the experience of Benin about the digital biometric identification system for almost everybody. Russian Federation is currently drafting a number of laws concerning digital economy issues, and obviously that the number of digital transactions will increase. But at the same time, there are some problems which should be resolved under the new order. How to keep the information about the biometric identification secret, and who has an access to this information and the database, who is responsible, who will be responsible on the national level for keeping this information in secret, and to protect people in biometric identification. And I think that Tom answered my questions, and he said that we need to comply with existing law, but the main problem, in my opinion, that a lot of lawyers don't know which provisions should be stipulated in law. So that's the problem. What kind of provisions should be in laws which should be adopted at the national level. So I think we need to think how we can help to all countries to improve their legal system on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your comments. Just before finishing, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Estrella, who will give us a final briefing of this day, of this presentation. Please, Mr. Estrella, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And before I do that, I'd like to point out that we have received a number of questions through the chat from participants, which we're unable to handle because we only have this slot of 2 hours, but I'd like to assure them that they will be sending the questions to the speakers via the chat and then relaying then the answers back to those who kindly join us for this first event of this series of webinars. And by doing that, also apologize for the technical difficulties we had from the beginning. This is all more than just virtual. We're actually doing in Vienna using a subscription out of Geneva in a conference that should have been managed via New York. And this is how we flexibly react to the circumstances. Now, I would like to begin by picking up something that Carla mentioned, I think is very important. The foundational legal framework for electronic commerce and also identification was not set up yesterday. It's been around for some time. The model law on electronic commerce, the model law on signatures, Mexico adopted them in 2016, but other countries have adopted, like Singapore and some states in the United States and various countries in Europe have had legislation on various aspects of electronic commerce and signatures for quite some time. But as also we've heard from Serge on the experience of Benin and also Carla in the experience of Mexico, some of these instruments had not been used in practice, and some business needed pressure to move digitally. And if I may use a French saying translated into English now, to something the bad luck is positive, was the saying in France, and then COVID is facing us with the need to finally move digital. Now that has then highlighted two issues which I think many of the speakers have referred to, and that is the issue of the interoperability of the identification systems. And the second issue is also the portability of your credentials. And this is something that both Tom and Andrea have alluded to. And one of the dilemmas we have so far is that we have lots of proprietary identification systems that are run by corporations when you authenticate them or to trade with them or in trading platforms. Now, what COVID has made us also understand is that beyond that, there's a lot of services out there and business that does require identification, and this is not covered by any of those existing systems. Hence, the importance of developing a system of identification that could also be used by those things that now we're forced to do online or virtually, and with yesterday we're used to doing on paper. Now, that has to be done, and also I think also Carla also alluded to, in a manner that is technologically neutral. There are various ways of authentication that can be used, and Tom also has referred to the flexibility and responsiveness of the private sector in developing solutions. At the same time, since you're venturing to this area, and both also Kawai and Serge mentioned that in the example of Singapore, but also Serge mentioned that, and Professor Choi Dong-Wan also mentioned that the many areas in which we're now being forced to go online, from education, health service, public service, all of them may require a certain level of certainty that perhaps not every provider of authentication service would be able to fulfill. And that is the crux of the matter, and that is what is central to the current work of Working Group 4. Tom listed the elements that should be in an instrument that aimed at ensuring interoperability and cross-border recognition, which is the central aim of what we're doing at Working Group 4. And I think, and I also speak for all my colleagues, and I also dare to say they speak also for you, Mr. Chairman, in saying that this was a very fortunate panel in that they all provided various angles of analysis of that situation that emphasize the timeliness and importance of the work that Working Group 4 is doing right now. And this is not just, is beyond just an academic exercise, and the current crisis has more than anything else emphasized how urgently that is needed at this point in time. So I think we have lots of interesting messages and that lessons that we've learned from this panel that our commission will be very happy to hear when we reconvene next Friday. So that, through you, Mr. Chair, I would also like to thank again all our speakers and all those who have asked questions, the states that have taken the floor, and all of those out there that have joined us for the seminar. And we all look forward to seeing or hearing from you again tomorrow at the second series of these webinars. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So see you tomorrow.